Welcome everyone. Just a few more seconds here and we're going to get started. Just a quick reminder, if you have any questions, comments, thoughts, you can use the little chat box from Zoom. And at the end of the session, I'm going to open it up for discussion and questions and things like that. All right, let's go ahead and get started. First and foremost, welcome everyone. Thank you for making the time to attend this webinar to talk about, Familia Soma and 5 key findings. And first and foremost, my name is Atanasio Segovia. I am the director of Familia Soma. And what I want to do today is share a little bit about my journey and how God has been teaching me, and in the process, teaching me a lot about the Latin American church. And I want to share that with you in hopes that it's a source of encouragement. And at the same time, my hope is that by the end of this webinar, you have some tools to be able to apply them and reach out to Latinos in your context. So let's get started. For those of you that don't know, Familia Soma is the full Family Soma expression in Latin America. What that means is, the way I like to describe it is, what would it look like if the Soma family of churches dropped a seed in Latin America and let nature grow it? What would it look like? What would be some of the unique differences and things like that? And a little bit more about where I am. I'm in central Mexico in a church called Soma Mosaico in the heart of Mexico called León, Guanajuato. And geographically, we're literally in the center of the country. Within 4 hours driving distance, I can reach most of the key cities in Mexico. So it's a pretty cool place, high desert. So we have nice weather year round. And right about now it gets a little bit cold. But what I also wanted to tell you is that some of the things that I'm going to be sharing with you today, and some of the key findings, come from, not just my time in Soma Mosaico, not just my time in Mexico, but also, through the other places where God has opened doors, including Costa Rica and the Dominican Republic. And if you want to know more about that, another source of this is, being able to train, by God's grace, close to 200 people, most of them leaders, in the last 6 months. So being able to gather that information and trying to process it, I'm hoping that it will be a blessing for you. All right, so the first key finding is really important, and I think it should be obvious for most of you, but, soccer or football is the most popular sport in all of Latin America, with the exception of maybe Cuba and the Dominican Republic, where baseball might be a close second. All Latinos, all Latino countries share a common love for soccer. Now, why is that important? Because just like soccer, I found that there's a common thing that unites all Latinos. And that's going to be key for you if you're trying to reach Latinos with the gospel. Not only do we share a common language, we share a common history, right? Most of Latin America, with the exception of Brazil, was colonized by Spain. The dominant religion that was introduced was Roman Catholicism. So there's kind of a baseline that we all share. And one thing that is really interesting, this was not my insight, but someone invited me to do a training with them in the Dominican Republic. And the person leading this effort was an American. And he mentioned that the reason why he liked to invite Mexicans or other Latinos to come and train the local leaders was that he found that there was this special connection between Latinos. Within a matter of hours, they were able to connect. And I got to see that when I went to the Dominican Republic. Within a few hours, we were able to connect. Same sense of humor, same level of expectations for things not starting on time and things like that. And by God's grace, I've been able to see that throughout Mexico and in Costa Rica as well. We're able to connect very, very easily. So that's key finding number one. If all Latin American countries share a common love for soccer, we also share a common bond. We're very centered in relationships and community. So if you're taking notes, the first thing if you want to do, if you want to reach out to Latinos, is you want to, make best friends with a Latino, first and foremost. Someone in your congregation that is Latino, because that person, you can see them as a person of peace. You can see them as a bridge builder. They're going to be key. They're going to be able to open relationships up very quickly within the community. And that's true in LA, and that's true in Mexico City, as well as San Jose, Costa Rica. So that's number one thing. Make sure that you are building true relationships with Latinos, especially if you're Anglo or an American. You want to make sure that you have a Latino that you're working with to reach out to Latinos. And I also think, honestly, one of the things is not just that we share a common heritage, but it seems to be multiplied when we become Christians. We have one more super thing in common, and that's Jesus Christ. So anyways, key finding number one, all Latinos, for the most part, generally speaking, love soccer. What that means is we have a common bond, and Latinos in general are able to connect with each other very easily. So if you're taking notes, and I'll share this with you later if you wish, key takeaways: share history, language, culture, allows Latinos to build relationships with each other much faster. This is only multiplied through Christ. So I would say if you are in the context or you have a desire to reach out to Latinos, what better way than to develop Latino leaders? They are going to be the key, if you will, to the Latino community and each other. All right, but what's really interesting is that though the most popular sport in all of Latin America is soccer, you'll find that each team is slightly different, right? What I mean by that, it would be kind of dangerous to say all Latinos are the same, obviously, right? There's 639 million people in Latin America. So each country has its own story, not just history, but story. So for example, the Mexican national team, there's this myth, this legend, if you will, called the Quinto Juego Maldición, which is, for whatever reason, the Mexican national team can't make it to the fifth game in a World Cup. As long as they're playing outside of Mexico, they will never be able to do that, or so we're told. And we see that over and over and over again. So whenever the national team is close to reaching that fifth game, something happens. We should win, but we can't. I'm not sure why, but that's part of our narrative. That's part of our story. Take someone like Argentina, completely different. They've actually won 2 World Cups. They're expected to make it easily to the quarterfinals, if not the semifinals. So though both Mexico and Argentina love soccer, the most popular game in the country, there's slight variations, slight differences. So what does that mean for you? I'm going to dive into it a bit more, because there's no common story of Protestant evangelical Christianity in Latin America. On the surface, 69% of it is Roman Catholic, and 19% of it is Protestant, if we were to take all of Latin America. But as you start diving into each country, they have a different story with evangelical Christianity. For instance, in Mexico, American missionaries started coming in late 1800s. Southern Baptists started sending missionaries to northern Mexico. And for whatever reason, Presbyterian churches from the northeast of the US started sending missionaries to southern Mexico. So what's interesting here is that the 2 largest denominations on paper are Baptist in the north of Mexico and Presbyterians in the south of Mexico. But the reality is that only 82% of Mexicans are Roman Catholic, while 7% consider themselves evangelical Protestants. So the story of how Christianity or evangelical Christianity was introduced to Mexico is different. Guatemala is a whole different story. Though it shares a southern border with Mexico, 47% of them are Roman Catholic, 40% Protestant. Your mileage will vary. Stats are very difficult to get in Latin America, but most reliable sources would say that Guatemala is close to 50% Protestant evangelicals. Why is that important? Because understanding the context allows you to understand kind of like the national teams, right? Like Guatemala's story with evangelical Christianity is different from Mexico. I want to share a few more takeaways from that as well, because not only is the stories different, but for example, I was actually talking to someone and they were sharing about the story of how they thought Christianity was introduced in Costa Rica. For example, most of the missionaries that went to Costa Rica were Pentecostal missionaries. So most of the churches in Costa Rica, one would argue, are Pentecostal. So if you say Christian in Costa Rica, what they really hear is Pentecostal / charismatic Christian. Whereas in Mexico, in northern Mexico, you might hear Christian and they think it's like a Baptist. Or if you go to southern Mexico, they think, when you say Christian, they think of a Presbyterian. So that's really important if you are trying to send missionaries or plant churches in all of these countries. The story is slightly different, and the same word can mean different things. So key takeaways from that point: Latin America is super diverse, right? Each country, like a person, has its own story. So, I would advise you to get to know the country you're trying to reach. One last example, this was my mistake when I came to Mexico. I described myself as a reformed charismatic, and I didn't know that charismatic had a very negative connotation in most churches here. They thought when I said charismatic, they thought what they came to their mind was someone kind of dropping on the floor and all kinds of stuff like that. So needless to say, I learned my lesson. I wouldn't describe myself as a charismatic Christian in Mexico anymore, because I know the term means something completely different in Mexico than, say, the US. So how can you learn all these things? Spend time with Latinos, spend time getting to know the country if you want to reach it. And this is really one I really, really want to dive into this a lot more, because though Latin Americans share a common love for soccer, and each country has its slight variation on their national teams, I would say there's a huge difference between Latin Americans and Americans when it comes to church planting and discipleship, and the overall thought when they think of churches. And I think you only need to look at the most popular sports. Obviously, Latin America, soccer. US, football, American football. Why is that important? Because one of the key findings is that as you're working in Latin America, you have to ask yourself, am I playing American football or am I playing soccer? So I'm going to dive into that a bit more. So for me, one of the things I started diving into this was that I realized that I never got an RSVP for parties anymore. I was just invited to parties, and there was no like, hey, can you confirm if you're going to be here? What would you like to eat? And how many people will come with you? It was more like, hey, you're invited. Next Saturday, show up. The assumption was that not only was I invited, but my entire family was invited as well as friends. They never asked what kind of food I wanted to eat, because they probably made pozole or something that allowed you to feed lots of people, right? So I started thinking about that a lot more. And in my trip to the Dominican Republic, it was really interesting because I realized that we had a schedule right on paper, like the time that we were going to start, the time that we were going to cover topics. And it became apparent to me that we were not going to be able to meet that schedule. I was totally fine with it. The friend that I was doing the co-training with, he was totally fine with it, but the American guy that we were with seemed a lot more nervous and anxious. And I started thinking about that, and I was like, wait, why does that happen? Why is it okay for us to just be totally cool with being late? And I realized that, I also spent time in the United States. I should have said that earlier. I grew up in the States. But there's a luxury in the US where everything kind of works, right? Traffic lights work, the water works, electricity works, everything seems to work. And I think a byproduct of that is that you can plan and schedule. You can literally say, we're going to start this time and we're going to end at this time. So far from what I've seen in Latin America, things don't always work. And the difference is that we don't expect everything to work. So, for example, though service might start at 11 a.m., the reality is that people are going to show up at 11:30, and that's perfectly acceptable because things happen, right? I would say that, we've learned in Latin America that we don't have full control over everything, and that's totally okay. So anyways, I was just thinking about that because that was just an observation, right? And then as we went into the training, like when I got to the building, it was in this little village, but it was really shocking to me to find out there was electricity. There was a speaker, there was a sound system, there was a whiteboard. And I think on the surface, it looked like a normal place where you can do a training. But I quickly realized that that was not the case because, for example, it started raining, and you can kind of see this, but the roof is made out of tin material. So as it was pouring, it was so loud, we had to stop the training. And nobody kind of cared. It started raining, we stopped, we started drinking more coffee, hanging out, and we waited it out. So another example of, well, we can't control everything, so it's perfectly fine to just, roll with the punches. So that's another key thing, which is, although sometimes churches or buildings and systems might look the same on the surface, the reality is they don't work the same. You can't rely on everything working perfectly fine. So that was another key finding, right? Which is time is different for many reasons in a Latin American context. And the way I like to describe it is, Americans live in chronos, Latin Americans live in kairos. Things happen when they happen because they should happen. And that's okay if it's not when it was intended. So it's a good way for us to learn grace, honestly, and patience. That's been one of the toughest things for me to learn moving from the States to Latin America, to be to be open and embracing the fact that things are not as they should be, and that's okay. But I wanted to dive into it a bit more because, I like to study things. And part of this comes from my experience running a multicultural team back in the States. There was a lot of training that was given to us by the company that I worked for, because we had offices worldwide and teams were multi-ethnic, multicultural. So there's this really cool framework by this Dutch psychologist. He calls it Hofstede's 6 cultural dimensions. His name is Gert Hofstede. But basically, he looks at a national culture, and he wonders, hey, why are they so different, right? Why is business different in Japan versus the US or Mexico? And he came up with 6 different dimensions that you can evaluate them. I quickly plugged it in on the website to compare Mexico with the United States. And the 6 different dimensions are power distance, individualism, masculinity, uncertainty avoidance, long-term orientation, and indulgence. So I'm going to just dive into the ones that are so different for Mexico and the United States and talk about how this has helped us explain some of the things we've seen. So the first one is power distance. Oddly enough, in Mexico, we have the highest number of all Latin American countries. What that means is, to the degree which people are comfortable with unequal distribution of power. So you could look at it as, how comfortable are people in Mexico with a manager having a lot of power and workers not having a lot of power? It's very tolerant. And managers are up here, workers are down here. There's a huge separation, and that's acceptable. Compare that to the States, where it's nearly half of that. It's more of a flat organization, right? Though someone has a title, you can still go tell them that you might disagree with them. That's accepted. In Mexico, you can't do that. It's not acceptable to do that. I think that creeps into churches as well, because there's a huge separation between pastors and congregations, and that's acceptable. So I think in the States, it's a lot more common or easier for someone to say, you know what, I disagree with your sermon. I think you did this wrong, and things like that. That would not fly in a Mexican context. And that impacts everything. Mexicans are, in general, I'm generalizing here using this framework, totally accept their position in life. And there is no American dream. There's no moving up the ladder. There's no concept of my kids will have a better life than I do. If you think about that, right, that impacts churches, right? Maybe once a church is planted, it is what it is, right? There's not a lot of leadership change. There's no concept of someone came in, planted it. That's their gift. They're going to move on and do something else. It's more like this person planted it. They're the leaders. They're going to stay there. So I think that's really important, because as you're trying to reach out to Latinos, one of the things you might want to consider is, avoid using titles. I know that's what we do here. I don't use a title, because the moment I use a title, I'm basically introducing this huge distance between myself and a person. So anyways, I'm mindful of that. Whereas the Mexican culture, if you have a title, you're supposed to use it to let people know it. But the reality is, the way you use that title is to create a power distance to let someone know like their pecking order. So anyways, that's a long way to say, like, you have to kind of evaluate that as you're reaching out to Latinos. How are you reaching out to Latinos? If you're training future leaders, how are you mitigating this? You know, what systems, what structures are you putting in place to cut that power distance or you know, mitigate it? Anyways, the other one is individualism. This is another dimension where the US and Mexico are completely different. And it's basically the degree of interdependence a society maintains among its members. Basically says, when a person, you know, sees themselves, they see themselves as an individual, like I, me, or do they see themselves as part of a group, a collective? In the States, I'm sure that's not a surprise for you. In the US, individualism is super, super important. It's a huge value, right? You do things. Compared that to Mexico, there's none of that. It's 30 versus 91. What that means is we're a very collective society. I'll give you an example, right? I had a birthday party where I invited some people. And I had to tell them it's an American invitation. What that means is I'm inviting you, your wife, and your children. I'm not inviting your extended family. I have to make that very clear because we're going to a restaurant. Long story short, within a couple of days, I started getting a bunch of messages of people apologizing for not being able to go to my birthday party. So I was like, wait, why did they do that? And the reason is they saw themselves as part of this group, friends and family. And even though they did not get the invitation or message, they feel like they should have. So they were apologetic about it. So that's really, really important. And I'm going to get into like how we've seen that play out in our churches, our local church, excuse me. But super important, right? Mexicans tend to have close long-term commitments to their family and friends. I would say doing all of this and evaluating it is, I was thinking about like even some of the way that Americans, missionaries do evangelism with a heavy emphasis on individual conversions, right? Like you make a decision, you follow Christ. And in light of this, I was wondering, at least something that I want to apply in our local churches, you know, talk about the benefit of the gospel to the entire family, to their family and friends, so that it's not so much just about them. And I'm saying that because what I've noticed as well here is I'm in the most Catholic, one of the most Catholic countries in all of Mexico, which really is most of the world as well. There's people that I've talked to, and one of their biggest hesitations with even stepping their foot in where we gather is that they will betray their family. And that's a big thing. The reality is, because they're collective or we're collective, making a decision to change religions, it's not just you. You're basically breaking off the family. So a key learning point from that has been, well, how do we engage families? How do we engage groups of friends? How do we create spaces where it's much easier for them to join a group rather than them making an individual decision to do something else? And that's just in Mexico. Uncertainty avoidance in Mexico, you know, we have a pretty high score, but basically means, you know, how comfortable are people with, you know, things that are different, right? Mexico super high, 82, versus the States, which is 46. The way you see that in churches is that if you're asking someone to go from being a Catholic to evangelical Protestant Christian, that's a big change. And even if you're asking them to gather outside of what they would see as a Catholic temple in another one, and that looks different, that's a drastic change. So anyways, a key learning lesson from that has been, well, how do you contextualize it? How do you create safe environments where they don't seem to be so drastically different, where you're not asking them to take a risk? Another interesting thing about uncertainty avoidance and the way I've seen it played out in Mexico is that, you know, generally speaking, Mexicans are not open to innovation, to different things. So if it works, it works. So this is my observation on, I also think that's why, say, a Southern Baptist or Baptist church in Northern Mexico, it almost feels like it was frozen in time to 100 years ago. That's also true for a Presbyterian church. I almost feel like if I went to any of these gatherings, it would almost be like a window in time to like, maybe 100 years before, or when the church was planted. So I'm going to share with you a couple of stories of how we've seen this played out. Duke, which I think it's on the call, but we came in, what I would argue was playing American football in our first training here in León, Mexico. And we did it as business as usual, right? We're presenting, people were sitting, and then, there was a time for questions and answers. So then we would ask a question, and we expected people to answer. It didn't really happen. People were quiet. They were not comfortable saying that. And now looking back into it, I feel like we came in playing American football and asked, tossed them the ball, and we're like, all right, go for it. So I think it was about, a third of the way through the training, we realized that, something had to change, and we broke them up into small groups, and the dynamic changed completely. People started being a lot more engaged and giving answers. And thinking about that, what was really interesting is that we essentially created a group, and we said, okay, you're not speaking on your behalf, you're speaking on behalf of the group. Now go ahead and give an answer. And that changed, and we've implemented that in other trainings. So that's another key finding, which is, again, like, even if we're bringing some trainings into Latin America, we have to contextualize them quite a bit. And I think one of the key findings is, if Latinos feel more comfortable working in groups, we should create those spaces to work in groups. If you're trying to reach out to the family down the street, you might want to create a space for a group, for a family, not just individuals. And the way we've applied that is, we're intentional. Every single one of the groups we've created in our local church has a name. This is like our future leaders group. We call it Banda Machos, mice in this occasion. But part of that is building that community. And one of the things that I think you might see as I use these pictures is, food is always involved. A table is always involved, because we value community, because we value friendship. It would be really awkward for us to do this, say, in the space where we gather, or make it more like a school setting. So we have to make it super welcoming. We have to create spaces where people can build friendships and know each other. So one of the things I noticed was that most of these young dudes were going to our church for a long time. But after creating Banda Machos, they started getting super involved with all of the other activities in the church. And it dawned on me that the reason for that is they felt like they were part of a group. We were not asking one of them to do one thing. We were asking Banda Machos to help. So they all kind of just naturally started working together, hanging out together. So that was really cool to see that in action. Our missional communities, we create spaces to invite their friends and family. So for instance, here, someone opened up their home. There's about half of our missional community missing from here, because it's kind of weird, but once you invite someone, they invite their friends and family. So, they're all going to show up. We'll have this weird rhythm of coming in and out. But our missional community gatherings, our family meals, tend to be pretty big because of that, because we don't invite a person, we invite a person, but they'll bring in their family and friends. So anyways, we try to create those spaces. Most of the things we do as a church, we try to create groups and, super like family oriented spaces. So when I say family, I don't mean like nuclear family, I mean extended family. So anyways, super key finding there. Another framework that I think is really helpful if you want to reach out to Latinos, it was by this lady named Erin Meyer. She wrote this book called The Culture Map. And I took this from an article I read a couple of years ago from the Harvard Business Review. But basically, each culture, each nationality is unique, and the way they deal with confrontation, as well as allowing themselves to show emotion, differs. So, for example, here, if you notice Mexico on the top right quadrant, there is an expectation that we're supposed to show emotion. The culture, values that. As a matter of fact, if you don't show emotion, it probably means you're not being yourself. So one of the things we've learned and we try to do in our local churches, preaching and things like that, we want to make sure that people are little bit more emotional, because if they're not emotional, it might be interpreted as they don't believe it. So knowing that, another challenge is that, in our culture, Mexican culture at least, we're totally not confrontational. We've developed a whole language to avoid confronting people. So for example, if I were to say, I totally disagree with you, the person that hears that is going to be deeply offended. Number one, they won't tell me, but they would not talk to me again. So I would have to say, you know what, can you explain to me a little bit more of what you mean? Because I'm trying to send a cue to that I'm disagreeing with them. Why am I telling you all of this? It's that as you're thinking of reaching out to Latinos, the thought that comes to mind is you got to ask yourself, are you asking them to play American football with you? Or are you asking them to, join a soccer game? They're very different rules. And that's one of the reasons why, at least in the description, I said, a Latino in the United States, maybe a second generation Mexican American, has a lot more in common with someone in Mexico than they do with their neighbor who happen to be an Anglo-American. Why? Because we're still, we still use the same type of communication skills. We still value community and things like that. One last thing on this one, avoiding confrontation. I think it's a challenge when you have, shared leadership. So one of the key findings, at least in my context, was, creating spaces where different elders could have open disagreements and coaching them through, what does that look like? Otherwise, there will be a lot of issues that were kind of festering underneath with no space to solve them because no one wanted to confront each other in a healthy manner. Anyways, so I could spend a lot of hours geeking out on that, but key takeaways, if you want to reach out to Latinos, if you want to develop like the next generation of Latino leaders, if God has placed you in that context, evaluate if you're training it to play American football or football. And there's a big difference. If you do want to reach out to Latinos in your context or in Latin America, if you send like missionaries, you have to create events and spaces to reach Latino families and groups, not just individuals, and create, familiar settings. Honestly, for us, it's an open table, having meals. That's super, super important. And if you already have some sort of training, if you already are reaching out to Latinos in your context, evaluate it, how much of it is actually contextualized. I think there's a lot of organizations and denominations doing great work in Latin America, but, if we use Mexico as an example, I almost feel like, the trainings, conferences, and things like that, it's more like, hey, this is how you play American football. Who wants to join it? And I think, out of lots of factors, but that might be a reason why, at least Mexico, it's still, the population of Protestant evangelicals is so low. So anyways, contextualize, reach out, share meals. Nothing's going to beat that. Emphasize how the gospel is good news to family and friends, not just individuals. And one of the things too about the 6 different dimensions, since Latinos are collective, highly loyal. Once a Latino joins your church, once they start following Jesus, they're going to bring their friends and family because, hey, they don't see themselves as just an individual making a decision. These are good news and must be shared with everyone. Another thing that also like another key finding is that not only are we different, we're playing different games. The way we communicate, I think, merits its own section. And the picture that I have here is huddles, right? And I think in American football, there's a huddle after every single play, right? We're going to strategize. Okay, we got to get the next 10 yards. How are we going to do that? What's the plan? What's the play? And yada, yada. So there's a lot of huddle. There's a lot of tactics. There's a lot of strategy. Soccer doesn't have that. At most, they have a huddle at the beginning of the game. The game is much more fluid. And I think it represents the way that the two cultures communicate very, very differently. Americans, I would argue, lots of process, lots of steps, how, when, why. Latinos, a lot more fluid. It happens when it happens. We got to score. We might have a general strategy, but let's wait it out. And that impacts metrics and expectations. So I'm going to dive into that a bit more, but this is not my idea. This is actually something that helped me out quite a bit. There's a book by Sung Chan Ra called The Next Evangelicalism. Highly recommend it. But he used this social theory, which I thought was really interesting, about how there's a primary culture and secondary culture, and how that impacts communication. So Latin America, it's primary culture, right? Tribal culture, personal culture. The most important unit is a person, right? It's heavy on relationships, right? When you say family, you're thinking of not just the wife and kids, but you're thinking of grandma, grandpa, uncle, and aunt. So there's this huge pool of people and relationships that need to be maintained and valued. And interestingly enough, the way they perceive spirituality is almost like mystical. And that's going to come into play in just a second. Now, how does information get shared? It's not through books. It's not written. It's actually oral, right? People tell stories. How do you communicate? Personal, visual. Let's meet. Let's hang out. I have a problem here. Let me go to your house real quick. And how does information get transferred? Through art, music, stories. If you're in the States, in the Bay Area or LA, that might actually been explained why you have murals in Latino neighborhoods, right? Secondary culture, which is mostly industrialized countries like the US and Canada, it's impersonal, right? Objects are prioritized, not people. So for example, you might go to Starbucks and get your coffee, and you're not really loyal to a particular Starbucks. You're loyal to the brand because you can get the same service and the same coffee anywhere you go. Whereas in primary culture, you might go to the same coffee shop because you like the barista and they're awesome and you have a relationship with them, regardless of who owns that coffee shop. Survival depends on knowledge, right? So the key value is knowledge. What do you know? Whereas in primary cultures like Mexico is who do you know? Families are different, nuclear, mom, dad, and the 2.5 kids. Reality is determined based on objective cognitive explanations. How does information get shared? Written, right? I have a new thing that I found out. Let me write a book. I need to know something else. Let me read a newspaper, or let me consume information from like a trusted source, which tends to be some sort of company. Whereas in Mexico, for example, the trusted source is a person. I'll give you an example of that. If you're having financial problems, you might ask your uncle, who might be in debt, who might not be handling his finances correctly, but you know what? He's your uncle, so you should go find out from him what he thinks about finances. And the scale of things, his opinion is just as great as Dave Ramsey. So think about that for a second, right? Because the way that actually impacts the way you might want to reach out to Latinos. In our context, we focus heavily on facilitation and also equipping key people to be like those knowledge holders that we hope people will start going to when they have questions. And we're hoping that these people can speak the gospel and train others to do that. Very different from grabbing a book and saying, here, read this. And by the end of it, practice it, and you might be gospel fluent. The way we've had to do that is invest heavily on key people, which are seen as sources of authority, so that they can then go and train others. Anyways, probably geek out on this quite a bit, but the key learning thing from this is that we communicate very differently. And you see that in the channels we use and the way we communicate in general. But before I get to that, this is super, super key. Time to accomplish something in Latin America or Mexico in a primary culture, it's going to take way longer than secondary culture like the United States. And here's why, right? If I'm going to go have a conversation with someone in the church, another leader, and say, hey, we need to achieve this. In the States, I could block out a time and say from 9 to 10, we're going to talk about this. And by the end of the conversation, we would have achieved something, because that's the point of it. In Mexico, I have to allow a lot of time. I'll show up, check in. How are you? How are things? How's the family? What are you up to? Did you see the news? What about this? What about that? I have to nurture the relationship. And only then, if there's time, and once I get past all like the relational building and nurturing, only then can we actually talk about business or the reason why we're talking. So honestly, that was a really big challenge for me to learn, because scheduling time was really difficult. It's hard to say from this time to this time, I'm gonna do that, especially if I'm gonna be having a conversation with someone. So what does it mean to you? If you wanna reach out to Latinos, be ready to spend a lot of time building relationships and having conversations, just getting to know the person for the sake of getting to know the person. Again, just to give you an example, we create spaces for that. What I found, some of the resources that I thought would take us, say, like 3 months, have taken us 6 months, 7 months, because someone has to process that information. Then we have to like share that information orally with the rest of the group, then have everyone in the group talk about it, make sure they understand it, they all give their opinions, make sure there's a consensus, because we're trying to build a group, and only then do we move past that. So being totally open and willing to embrace the fact that something might take you 2 to 3 times longer than in the States is perfectly acceptable and expected. So I think that impacts the way you do metrics, right? If you're supporting a missionary in Latin America, for example, or someone trying to reach out to Latinos in the States, you know, what do you measure? I think in a normal setting, you might want to measure numbers, conversions, baptisms, events, programs. I would say in Latin America, the metrics are slightly different, or very different, which is, you know, how much time are you spending with each person? It might seem really slow. It might not seem productive, but the reality is, if you want to play soccer, if you want to reach out to people that play soccer, you have to use different stats to evaluate success. Just a quick things in terms of even how we communicate in Latin America that is very different from the States. In the States, email is like the way people communicate, right? You want to share a resource, you might post it online and then send it via email. You want to communicate, you send an email, lots and lots of emails. In Latin America, we use something called WhatsApp, which actually mirrors more the way people communicate, relational, very quickly. Email allows you to schedule, to batch things and stuff like that. So if you want to reach out to Latinos, you have to take that into consideration as well. If you want to share content, the first thing is, how are you going to distribute that? Through email? I would argue then, you know, you might be teaching some of these leaders to play American football rather than meeting them where they are and playing soccer. Another key finding too is, you know, even the way we consume information is different. Facebook, I know that in the States, I think it's going out of style, but in Latin America, it's still very important. Internet service providers don't charge you to use Facebook as data, whereas YouTube or any other web pages eat up a lot. They don't eat up a lot of data, but they do charge for it. So if you want to reach out Latinos, you have to think of how in the world are you sharing content? Is it written? You probably should be using video. Are you distributing it through email? You might want to use WhatsApp. Little things like that. Now, why is that important? Latin America, 69% Roman Catholic, 19% Protestant. I read an article, and this was fascinating. It says that across all the 18 countries that they surveyed, and Puerto Rico, a meeting of nearly 2/3 of Protestants, 65%, identify as Pentecostal Christians. So what's really interesting to me from that perspective, when I read that stat and then like having meditated on all of the stuff that I shared with you, I really think that one of the factors why Pentecostal or charismatic churches are growing so much in Latin America, it's because they're kind of playing soccer, right? Since Latinos, we want more emotional displays. You know, Pentecostal churches, charismatic churches tend to do that. Typically, you know, to become a pastor in one of these new Pentecostal churches doesn't require some sort of formal training. It requires a lot of relationship with the lead pastor, and you might be then sent out to plant a church. So anyways, I really think one of the factors why they're growing so much in all of Latin America is simply the fact that they are playing soccer. They are building systems or no systems, but that mirror more like what the culture expects than say other denominations and networks who are essentially training people to perhaps be American football players. But anyways, I thought it was a really interesting finding, and led me to think about like, well, Soma, how in the world do we do that? How do we play a lot more soccer than American football? And by now you should be kind of concerned, because I was like, hey, you haven't talked about God, you haven't talked about Jesus or the Holy Spirit, which is the fifth and last finding. God is moving in Latin America. So I would say follow the Holy Spirit. The way I've seen that in my context is the relationships in all of these other countries and places in Mexico, the Dominican Republic, and Costa Rica. They were opened up by the Holy Spirit. I didn't know anybody. So I would say God is on the move in Latin America. His Holy Spirit's building the church. So what better way to partner with him than, prayer and fasting? So yeah, takeaways from now on is pray, fast, and listen to what the Holy Spirit is doing. Who is he placing in your life? Is he placing Latinos in your context? Is he asking you to reach out to Latinos? And if that's the case, well, how could you make it easier to reach them? And so if you're in the States and you're in this webinar, it's not just about Latin America. It's the fact that there are 41 million native Spanish speakers, plus 11 million that are bilingual in the United States. People that might be your neighbors or might be in your same city, but in a weird way, they're in a whole different world, right? Because their values, their view of the world is completely different. And that's a trend that is going to continue, right? In Texas, I read it somewhere, it's supposed to become the state with the largest Hispanic population by 2022. So how do you reach Latinos? I would argue invest heavily in relationships. Out of all those 6 dimensions, if you plug in some Central American countries with Mexico and stuff like that, there's some slight variations, but the one thing that all of them have in common is that they're collective societies. They value groups, they value families. So if you want to reach Latinos, I would say, what better way than to start creating those spaces where the good news of Jesus Christ is, it impacts a family, it impacts your friends. And honestly, I can't think of a better way than creating spaces where you're breaking bread with Latinos instead of asking them to come to an event and things like that. All right. That's a lot of information. I hope that was helpful. And also at the same time, I want to know if you have any questions, because I'd be happy to answer them. So if you have any questions, please type them in. Or let me know, I can unmute you. So any questions, thoughts, comments, please let me know. All right, so no questions, no comments. Oh, wait, someone raised their hand. That is a really cool thing. Okay, Daniel, I've unmuted you.
Well, Atanasio, you did a great job. That was an incredible presentation. I feel much more equipped to spend time and encourage and share the gospel with Latinos. So not really a question, but I wanted to encourage you and tell you that was super amazing. And it's a lot to digest too.
Yeah, thanks, brother. I realized that. I was like, oh, that was a lot of information. Thank you. Okay, so a question came up. Let's see. So I'm going to read it. I hope you don't mind. Thanks a lot for your presentation. I have a question. I'm in Canada, and we have a new family from Chile. Now, each time we eat, the man of the family doesn't eat until everyone else does. For 20 people that they imagine. Oh, wow. That's really interesting. I don't have an answer for that, but you might want to ask indirectly, like, hey, thanks for waiting to eat until everyone else finished. That's really nice of you. Can you help me understand why? So yeah, just to avoid being directly saying, hey, why aren't you eating, or why do you wait until the very end? I hope that helps. But first and foremost, I would encourage you just to spend some time with this person outside of it. outside of your gathering, maybe some coffee. All right, so somebody else sets a question. Allowed to talk. Unmute. Oops. No, wait, Israel. Hi, Israel.
Hey, how are you, Atanasio? This is Israel Munguia. I have a question. Do you have some material or resources that you can bring to the table? Like, I am a Hispanic church planter, but I know in the traditional way to planting churches is most the Anglo-American way.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, you can suggest me some kind of material to see the difference or to see how this work?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I'd love to spend some more time hearing you out and make sure that I'm like, if I have the resources, provide them to you. So yeah, if you can just chat me your email address, or we might actually have it. But yeah, where are you planting?
I am in Indianapolis.
Indianapolis, trying to reach Latinos?
Yes.
Yeah, perfect. So super biased, right? But I think missional communities are a great way to do that. And that's the way we're doing it here in León, Mexico. Okay. And I have a little bit of experience in the States, but creating a space for friends and family to meet has been really helpful. But love to chat with you a bit more afterwards.
Yeah, I love your illustration about the football and soccer and how this play and mean to me bring a lot of light, in what I'm doing. Thank you.
You're welcome. And just a quick thought on that. I went through a church planting program, which was awesome, loved it, but it was a little bit challenging for me because I felt like parts of it was I was trying to learn to play a sport that I was not really wanting to play. But anyways, happy to share more time with you.
Okay.
All right. Any other questions? Someone else typed in something. Let me a quick second. Oh, cool. It was more of a source of encouragement. Thank you so much. I didn't get your name. It says 1+60, but thank you so much for that. I realized it was a lot of information. Looking back into it, I wish I would have spent like half the time on some of those topics. But net, relationship building, the biggest thing, if there's one thing you can take away from this. All right, so someone asked a question, wondering how to include Latinos who seem to be late in the North American context. That's a challenge, and that's a challenge with when you're doing multicultural things. I guess the first question you have to ask yourself is, are you trying to play American football or soccer? Because they're slightly different, right? If you're trying to reach just purely Latinos and creating a space for them, I would say it's totally acceptable. You should expect it to be, for most people, to be late. But if they're joining more like Anglo-centric, gathering, there might be like, hey, let's talk about this. Let's talk about why you're running late. I haven't been able to crack that, honestly. So what we do in our local context, because I still get a little frustrated with people showing up late, is we tell people to show up 15 minutes before. So that will kind of balances it out. But beyond that, I can't think of anything else. All right. Any other questions? Cool. And I think if you're interested or want to find out more, I'll be more than happy to I think we're going to send a follow-up email. Also, if you want to chat one-on-one, please let me know, and we can schedule some time to talk a little bit more about your context and situation. And with that, thank you so much for making the time. Appreciate it.